By the way, I just saw that the UK has announced its entry for the Eurovision Song Contest. So having a microphone in my hand is very exciting in that regard. But of course, we are delighted to be hosting the Eurovision Song Contest on behalf of Ukraine in Liverpool. So we all look forward to that in May. This second panel, last panel, we are going to do a bit of forward looking. As I said in my opening remarks, sanctions are easier said than done. And so what we want to talk about in this conversation is how we actually maximize the impact of sanctions. After all, that's what we are meant to be doing. Now, there's a lot of work people are doing, both in governments and in the research world, trying to figure out what impact sanctions are having. If you get 100 people together, you'll get 101 different answers as to what impact sanctions are having. And of course, that's because, as we were talking about earlier, Russia has agency. I think we can pretty much assume it's cannibalizing its civilian economy in order to support its military economy and doing all sorts of other things like that. But what we want to talk about in this panel is the perspectives from three different directions on how do we in 2023 maximize the impact of sanctions. So I'm delighted that we have the private sector representation, we have a kind of quasi-government representation, and we have a research representation. So I will, as with the first panel, kick things off with some questions to the panelists. Then please do take the opportunity to ask questions and wait for the roving mic. And if you're online and want to ask a question, then someone is going to send me the questions to my phone. So I'm not getting bored and I'm looking at it. I am trying to engage with our online audience and we would be delighted to take those questions as well. So I was going to start, if I may, with Kim Olsen. So Kim wrote a report that I recommend you all take a look at, which you can find online, and it was about the sanctioning of warfare. Now, I'm going to try and stop us looking backwards in this discussion because that's what Kinga led us through earlier on. So I wanted to start by asking Kim, based on the work that he did last year, what did it suggest to you that we need to be thinking about in terms of steps forward to, if you like, make that sanctioning of warfare as effective as possible?
Well, thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone. Delighted being here. And indeed, I wrote this report for the Danish Institute of International Studies, the sanctioning of warfare, looking at the early lessons from the EU's geoeconomic response to the Russian aggression. And I think I want to highlight a few points, really zooming a bit out from the conversation, from the very important conversation that we have had this morning, taking us back to the very beginning of sanctions conversation in the EU, them being a tool of foreign and security policy and part of the CFSP. Because I think most would agree that the EU sanctions use demonstrated how the EU can actually act as a unitary security actor, much more than in the field of weapons delivery and military aid. You know, in this field, we have had much more divergent views in the EU than on sanctions, which is also, I guess, a function of the unanimity required in the Council. But I do think that we need to acknowledge that we're not now beyond the shock phase. And the shock phase last spring was, of course, extremely important in order to garner consensus around sanctions. But it also, in my view at least, made us unaware of that we might not be completely in line across the Union why we do have these sanctions and what the end goals are. Because, of course, the three objectives we all know about were set out, about crippling the Kremlin's abilities to finance its war, about imposing costs on the Russian elite with links to the war, and about diminishing Russia's economic base. But the question is, so these are objectives, what is our end goal? And from my research, coming back to that, I had the so to say the strong sentiment that in certain parts of Europe, the sanctions are against what you can call Putin's war and against the Kremlin, with the end goal of getting Russia out of Ukraine. In other parts of Europe, it's seen a bit more in a broader perspective. There's this called, it's Russia's war. And Russia's war not only against Ukraine, but Russia's potential war against other neighbors as well. Meaning that the sanctions should not just encourage, incentivize, if you like, Russia to get out of Ukraine, but much more, and coming back to the crippling of Russia's economy, ensure that this can never happen again. And even though the two policy goals are closely aligned, they are very different. And this comes back to the question, why are we having the sanctions? And what is, again, our aim with them in the longer term? A second thing I want to highlight is that we need to learn better to talk about geoeconomic instruments and weapons, if you like, in a less static way. So with that, I mean that we are, in these discussions, are the sanctions working or not? We are often coming back to the objectives we set out in the very first hours, days, and weeks of a conflict. But a conflict is changing, a conflict is evolving. Tom, you mentioned the agency of Russia, and that Russia is, of course, reacting to what we are doing on our side. And I presume that when we talk about military warfare, we are much more sensitive to the point that, well, as a military situation evolves, we also need to change our objectives and ask ourselves what is possible and what is not possible with the tools we have at hand. I think this is important that we learn to talk about this in the geoeconomic field as well as setting out indicators, because it's not enough. I mean, we are always saying sanctions work in the medium and in the long term. Okay, that's a very fair point. But what does the medium term mean? I mean, when have we reached the medium term? Is that now, after a year? Is that 3 years? Is the long term 10 years? It's an important message sending, right? That sanctions do not work in the short term, but we need to be clear of what does the medium and long term actually mean. And this takes me to another point, focusing more on the being better to identifying the successes of sanctions and the costs of sanctions. And especially the latter has been very difficult, I think, for policymakers around Europe to acknowledge, or at least to isolate and pinpoint in their public communication. Because we most European countries, we're hearing the broad messaging to public, sanctions will have costs. But it's very rare that we hear politicians saying, here's a cost. This is because we use sanctions, my dear friends. Being better to identifying that and also pinpointing that is not only a matter of showing to the public what sanctions do on both sides and also on our side, but learning to use them as a power tool. And I'm now making a comparison. Of course, it's a bit far-fetched, but just to give you the image, when we use military power, we have politicians standing up to the direct costs that we are facing, which is often human lives, right? So when we lose women and men in combat, we have mostly ministers of defense standing at airports, showing the coffins with the flags on, saying this, and standing up to the use of power instruments, saying this is the cost, pointing at it, saying I take political responsibility for this. Of course, it's two very, very, very different fields, but I'm just to get you the image that we need to be better to pinpoint the cost and stand up to them. And this will take me to my last point I want to start with. We need to have a better discussion on whether we use sanctions as a tactical tool or as a strategic tool. If we stay to the claim that sanctions work in the medium and long term, this directly takes us into the strategic field more than into the tactical field. During 2022, we saw some examples where sanctions were used as a tactical response to what happened in Ukraine. And from a political and a moral point of view, this is absolutely understandable. And I'm talking about the horrible events in Bucha and Irpin, where politicians, looking at these horrors and massacres, of course, you want to react and you want to do something. And you then, take a sanctions package and say, we are reacting, we are punishing, so to say, Russia with these sanctions. The problem is that in the public, for those who are not necessarily following sanctions as the details of how sanctions are used, you get the sentiment that you can actually do something about massacres in Ukraine with sanctions also in the short term. And of course, it's about undermining the ability of doing this in the long term. But it's important, I think, in terms of public communication, that we make very clear what sanctions can be used for and not, and do not frame them in a way where they actually do not make a difference in the very, very short term. And last but not least, because it was mentioned also earlier this morning, the role of the private sector. And it relates to the tactical strategic thing. It was mentioned by, I think, our colleague from SIFMA, how much of a political pressure there was in the beginning of the conflict of making these sanctions packages work. I mean, we know from research and policymakers in Brussels, we know this by heart, that some of these packages were adopted within very, very few hours. And processes that normally take weeks only took hours this time because the political pressure was so high. And this, of course, as was mentioned, makes it very difficult to get stakeholders on board and get their views. But instead of just, saying, well, this is how it is, we need to talk about the very fact, are we willing to, again, adopt sanctions so quickly? I mean, if we acknowledge them to being a strategic tool, does it really make a difference whether this takes a few hours, a few days? Probably not in terms of their effects, right? So we need to look at the decision-making structures, and we need to carve out crisis mode that does not go into overdrive, and that makes a room for private sector and others to actually come in. That, on the other hand, will also require some responsibility on parts of the private sector, because if we talk about corporate geopolitical responsibilities, or the ESGs you mentioned, right, the G, the governance aspect, well, then we need to build rooms of confidence between government officials and private sector, where private sector can come in with their views, but you can be absolutely sure that details are not being leaked. So this is also about finding ways of communication with private sectors to tell these representatives, you guys are now geopolitical actors. Okay, this is not just about profit. This is about security, national security. So you need to step up to that responsibility, and you need to ensure that, well, you need to keep information and conversations in a certain room in order to have that room to get input from stakeholders that are not normally part of our foreign and security policy conversations.
Kim, thank you very much. You mentioned right at the top about sort of clarity of objective and communication. I've been struck by the variation of objectives that the sanctions have at times been positioned as having, from, of course, initially deterring the full-scale invasion through to degrading and disrupting the Russian military, but also setting Russia's capability to do this again back sufficiently far. So that there is a kind of a spectrum of ambition. So I wanted to ask you a follow-up question, because a lot of what you talked about there, you could sort of summarize about as sort of better communication at the EU level. An area that we also talked about this morning is the question of third countries. So when it comes to communication, how do you think the communication the EU is having to its own member states and its own citizens, how can that also perhaps be brought to bear on the third countries that we want to likewise kind of understand the messages that the EU is delivering?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and I do think that, especially in the beginning of the conflict, there were, and we very quickly heard the messaging from third countries where they become unaware what will these sanctions mean for us? Will they have an impact on food security, for example, or if you guys are starting doing energy sanctions, which was, the question in the beginning, will you then start buying gas from North Africa, which is used by other North African countries, and that will no longer flow, say, to them? All these questions come up, and I acknowledge it's extremely difficult to have the whole world in mind while trying to focusing on a very specific country in your backyard. Conflict in your backyard. But the more precise we can be about our objectives, I think this also speaks to the objectives of other countries, right? And especially neighboring third states. If they agree to the objectives, then it will be much easier to have conversations around, the sanctions tool and what they can do, even though they do not in themselves impose sanctions, what they can do to help us that our sanctions work better.
Great, thank you very much. I'm sure we'll come back to some of that, and of course you mentioned the private sector, but we have the expert coming up in a second, so we'll definitely come back to that. So Xavier, so you're an advisor on economic affairs at the Center for Analysis, Planning and Strategy at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in France, which, as I have learnt, gives you the pleasure of being sort of inside government, but not, and therefore able to speak your mind, which is always a joy. So with that in mind, you've obviously looked from your chair at a number of different sanctions regimes over the years. So what does your experience teach us about how we maximize the effectiveness of sanctions, and how do you think that might translate into EU actions in 2023?
Yes, thank you, Thomas. Yes, it's always good to remind that I'm speaking in my personal capacity, not as a spokesperson for my administration. Well, actually, the record of the effectiveness of sanctions in terms of regime change of behavior is quite negative. In the best of cases, you reach your aims in around a third of the sanctions program that were implemented. If you try to change the behavior of the countries that is targeted. Of course, the case is more convincing if you assess the effectiveness of sanctions against the ability of Russia to finance and to provide modern weaponry to its war effort. Well, the conversation is evolving towards the issue of implementation, but I guess we still have some room to further strengthen sanctions. I think that EU exports towards Russia amount to around 40 to 50% of their pre-war level, and the European Union will continue to buy Russian gas this year for at least 20 billion euros. That's a figure I took from Bruegel. So there is still room for strengthening those sanctions. But on the issue of the effectiveness and how can we mobilize, convince the global South to join us, or at least to deprive Russia of new trade opportunities. I think there is a debate emerging of the usefulness for Europe to implement secondary sanctions the US way. Well, this morning we were reminded of the principal position of the European Union, which is that its sanctions should be consistent with international law as an international based order. And I think yes, we should balance the effectiveness of potential EU secondary sanctions against third countries entities against the political cost that would entail a change of this position by the EU. And what we have to assess is that we are already on a shaky ground in the south only with our autonomous sanctions, which has qualified as which are criticized as unilateral in a majority of countries of the south. Even countries like Brazil that do vote resolutions condemning the infringements of the UN Charter and the violation of the territorial integrity of Ukraine, they deem that any sanctions that is not approved by the Security Council is illegitimate. And in the global south, you have very few instances of autonomous sanctions in the economic field. The only examples I could pick were from West Africa, from ECOWAS, against Côte d'Ivoire and Mali. So there is a sense that these so-called unilateral sanctions are an expression of an acceptable infringement on national sovereignties, and that those countries have to suffer from the economic consequences a conflict they see as a regional conflict. And when you present to them the fact that some key principles are in jeopardy for the international order, but well, they will always answer the argument of the double standards. And we just celebrated the first year of the invasion of Ukraine, but there is another unfortunate celebrations which come on the 20th of March, which is a 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, and so usually that's the example that is referred to. So I think to convince those countries from the global south, but we could qualify as a transactional south, to cut ties with Russia, you just have to offer them a better deal. To see what are the key strategic products that Russia can provide them, i.e. grains, energy, nuclear energy, weaponry, and in what measures can the West offer them a better deal, alternative sources of provision of those goods. I think that's diplomatic and economic outreach is the path to follow. And to conclude about the issue of the balance we struck between sanctions and arms delivery at the beginning of Ukraine, I like to pick the idea of Nicholas Mulder, who is an American researcher who wrote a book on the economic weapon. And in his mind, he was pointing out that if we went so strong on sanctions at the beginning of the invasion, it was because we underestimated the strength of the Ukrainian resistance, which we thought that the war would be over in a few weeks, and that the economic field would be the only one when we could answer to Russian aggression. So I think we have to assess the effectiveness of our sanctions. We have to also assess when they are counterproductive in terms of elite cohesion in Russia, in terms of their direct or indirect effect on the issue of global food security, which is very sensitive to countries in the south. So, and we should provide, when necessary, the exemptions or that are required. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Xavier. Your question on counterproductivity is actually one that I would have asked as a follow-up to DG FSMA, because I do kind of wonder whether if we go through the list since February last year, are there sanctions that we actually put in place which in hindsight maybe are not necessary, or we could thin out, and perhaps that would help the private sector. The other point that you made, which actually echoes to some extent the point that Kim made, which is that collectively we've been very bad, I think, at developing what some people would call a kind of an economic security strategy. We have for many years now kind of assumed that globalization is a wonderful thing, the private sector should get on with what it's doing, and the government should stay out of the way of what the private sector is doing. But I think what we're finding is that, as you put it, there's a deal of kind of realpolitik in this, and if you give people things that they want, they'll come your way. But that might require governments to get involved more in sort of the development of private sector trade connections with third countries. So something to think about. So we need to give the private sector its voice. Lima is an advisor to Finance Latvia, and has been sort of, I suppose, thinking about the implications of sanctions deeply, well, for quite some time, but in particular over the last 12 months. We put a lot on the private sector to help us achieve effectiveness on implementation. So what do you need to see in order for the sector that you represent to support maximizing this effectiveness?
Yes. Hello, everyone. It is my pleasure today to represent the financial sector of Latvia, a small financial sector in the sense of the European Union, but nevertheless with a huge commitment to comply with the sanctions implemented against Russia and all the other nations who are in war. Nevertheless, I would start with referring to what Tom mentioned. I think we definitely need to talk about how we need to maximize the success and also by reducing the costs, because nevertheless, the sanctions, when they are implemented, they are mostly implemented by the private sector. And private sector, of course, can be as successful as much resources private sector has to deliver the sanctions and the goals of the sanctions to be in place. I have made 5 points regarding how we could do that by leading also with the example what is not working at the moment. And I would like to start with the harmonization issue, which of course are the problem not only regarding the different regulations across the Europe, but also regarding the implementation stage and explanations on how exactly sanctions need to be implemented. What is caused by a lack of harmonization regarding the EU sanctions? Well, it's definitely the possible case of jurisdiction shopping. It means that the entities who are in willingness to breach the sanctions, to evade sanctions, to find their path, they are looking towards to the jurisdictions who has less consequences, who are more vulnerable for the sanction evasion, who are more willing to take up the risks in both from the public sector perspective and from private sector perspective. So that's definitely that need to be in place in 2023 in order to maximize the success of the sanctions. Secondly, it's definitely about the prioritization. We all know that although financial sector, of course, have known the sanctions for many, many years, and it's a lot of awareness how implement sanctions exactly. Nevertheless, the European Union new packages are coming up more with also new ways, new approaches, new sanctions, as for example, this 100,000 euro balance limit for the account. And nevertheless, if we won't prioritize what we need to achieve in the sense of objectives, we will just find ourselves in the place where will be no resources to implement all adequately. It's also related to the reporting requirements, etc. We need to concentrate on that it is most important to achieve the main goal of the sanctions, to reestablish the peace and security of international society. Third question, and I love the discussion already in the first panel, it's about the involvement of the private sector. I definitely wouldn't agree with the statement that it's impossible. Ukraine is doing impossible things. We definitely may find ways how to get private sector involved at the beginning of drafting the sanctions. Of course, not regarding the lists of the sanctioned persons, but regarding the specific nuances, how sanctions need to be implemented, for example, in the payment systems, because no one knows better than those who need to make these payment systems work. And this is either the traditional banking sector or others affected sectors. I definitely believe that there is a possibility to find in private sector the persons with who are trustworthy and who has enough clearance to be able to help. And if it's about the speed, well, in banking sector, speed is everything, and it's definitely not the Brussels speed. So to add about the resources, we definitely need to understand also who pays at the moment when the sanctions is implemented, for example, in the financial sector side, and it's again about the prioritization. We need to concentrate on the sanctions which is most effective, also because the bank's resources, the private sector are involving in order to be compliant with the sanctions. It is related to resources of the bank, of bank's everyday work. It means that the resources are taken from another another tasks that need to be done by the banks. So it's all about also this prioritization of the sanctions and putting more the material things in place, not the formal ones in order to be compliant totally. I can only compliment already comments which have been made regarding the communication. And here's one crucial thing that need to be understood, that each and every person is responsible for being compliant with the sanctions. Banks too, of course, but banks are not the competent authorities, and banks are not the ones who need to make a clearance regarding whether person is complying, whether the client is compliant with the sanctions. It's not the way how to check whether the payment can be done or not by already initiating the payment, for example, for sanctioned person. The persons need to be aware, and in the lack of communication, it cannot be done. And it's, of course, leads to the consequences when we are not compliant with the sanctions. It doesn't actually depend whether it's criminal liability, administrative liability, or secondary sanctions. It just definitely need to be effective enough for persons to be willing to avoid as possible for sanction evasion. And I would say that maybe at this stage, when we already have quite huge packages of the sanctions, we need to speak actually more also about sanction evasion topic and concentrate on this one in order how we can get more effect here. And to conclude, last but not least, to encourage to cooperate with private sector, I can only say that we are not, like in movies, partners in crime. Here we are partners in fight against the crime. So implementation, it wouldn't be such a challenge for all the steps we need to take in order for all of us to be more efficient and really to deliver the goals of the sanction, which I will take at this stage very broadly. It's just to ensure the peace and security in the international community. Thanks.
Laima, thank you. Thank you very much. I wanted to, before you put the microphone down, I wanted to ask you, we've talked quite a bit about communication on this panel. Can you talk a bit about communication within the private sector? And I mean both between the banks in Latvia, but also, of course, banks move money across borders. And so the communication between, the extent it exists, between private sector entities that are operating across borders.
That's a very good question. Well, at the moment, I see that in some cases, the private sector are stepping into public sector shoes and are communicating more to the clients than it is maybe done by the public sector, because of course the first stage when the clients who are also obliged to comply with the sanctions, especially in trade sector, first sector they are approaching it is the banking sector. Therefore, banks are the ones who are delivering the message that you cannot do this, you cannot do that. And it's in a very few cases, it's also the case when the person just don't know that it's not allowed. It's there has been cases, for example, in Latvia, at Latvian border, where a company tried to smuggle in the cigarettes in the hidden wood package, which is not allowed, of course, under the sanctions regime, but nevertheless, they were thinking that they are just doing the smuggling, not a sanction evasion case. So nevertheless, it is about the communication, and there is huge gaps there. But I liked also the thought, and we are asking it on our side too. We see also the patterns of the payments, we see the patterns of the trade. So there is, of course, a question, and it relates what I already said previously regarding sanction evasion. So we need to pay also the attention to the sectors maybe where previously the attention wasn't paid so much. On other payment institutions and cryptocurrencies, etc., because there definitely are quite a huge risks which aren't taken on board at the moment. The banking sector are one of the most regulated sectors all over the world, but nevertheless, the gaps most possibly aren't here.
And can I just draw you a bit more on the interaction with other countries? So your colleague from the FIU, Paulus, is here as well, and you guys from Latvia are very active in engaging in these sort of across Europe discussions on public-private partnership and so on. How have you leveraged that in talking to, dare I say it, your neighbors in Lithuania or kind of other places where financial institutions based in Latvia also have operations? And of course, back to the point about lack of harmonization, that surely creates gaps.
In the last 12 months, there has been steps taken towards the harmonization between the Baltics, at least as far as I know. The regulators are meeting, the FIUs are meeting in order at least to make the harmonization at the Baltics level. But nevertheless, as we all understand the situations, of course, we never will be able to harmonize everything, and that is not the goal. The goal is to reach the most effective stage for the implementation of sanctions, and to in order for that we need to harmonize, because nevertheless Lithuanian situation with the border, also Latvian situation with the border with Russia, which aren't in place actually for other EU countries, are different. So there need to be more prioritization and effectiveness regarding that. But nevertheless, we are stepping up and trying to expand more the collaboration, very good collaboration we are having in Latvia regarding public-private partnership. We are trying to bring it up also on a Baltic level and forward. So at the moment there is a differences also at Baltic level, but hopefully it will be solved soon.
The one challenge I always put to policymakers who sit behind their desks and require the private sector to do something is, when did you last spend a day sitting in the sanctions compliance unit of a bank in your country and actually see what the reality is of what you produce? So if you're a policymaker or you're sitting at DG FISMA and you've never spent any time in a bank, please rectify that, because I think that's actually an important experience to have, so you appreciate the implications of the requirements you then place on the private sector. I wanted to come back to something which hasn't really been spoken about. Michael might have mentioned in the first panel, I can't remember, but this is a tool that I think people are hoping will help us be better informed about what is happening on sanctions implementation, specifically failure to implement and evasion, and that's kind of whistleblowing. I wondered, Kim, whether you had any perspective on this, on sort of how we might expect to see that develop as an information gathering tool as part of enforcement action in the EU.
Well, I think every step that can be taken to integrate voices, either on when there is problems or specific violations or circumventions of sanctions, but also much broader, is important. So it was mentioned, this is all about the input side and gathering information. And I think we're still in the very early stages of actually being able to gather that information in a structured way. So I think the whistleblower tool is a very important step in that direction. But we could also think a bit beyond that. It was mentioned in the first panel that the views of the private sector is now being, well, there's an outreach and there are high-level meetings going on. I think it's not clear who's involved in these conversations, right? And how are these conversations being, so to say, selected? If we would think a bit more, if we start thinking a bit more seriously about sanctions as a geoeconomic instrument, such as other geoeconomic instruments that are at the EU's disposal, maybe we could also start thinking about garnering, setting up a bit more formalized information streams. I myself have been writing about the possibility of creating so-called geoeconomic committees, finding ways, I mean, we've for decades been used to in EU legislation to get the ECOSOC's views, for example, right? The idea that civil society is heard, the economic operators are heard in normal EU legislation. Well, EU sanctions are also normal EU legislation, but they're just done under the umbrella of foreign security policy. Other ways and means where we can structure these debates much more, and also making the representatives accountable for what they are proposing to policymakers. That it's not just those that are, that have the best access to various parts of the system that are being heard with their own, well, so to say, very individual implementation struggles. But that is much more structured way. I know this, of course, happens at the member state level, but in order to get this information stream also upstream, so to say, to where the legislation is made in this city. I think we need to work more on that.
Great, thanks very much. So if people have questions, stand by to raise your hand and the mic will rove its way to you. Before we, Nicoletta, before we come to you, and we've got on here as well. So I just wanted to ask Xavier, you a quick question. You mentioned the whole issue of counterproductivity in your remarks. I wonder if you could sort of expand a bit on that, and how, again, 2022 was about running as quickly as possible and getting sanctions on the board. And now we need to sort of think about them in more detail. So when you talk about counterproductivity, do you have specific experiences from the past or indeed current in mind?
Yes, thank you. Well, among the sanctions whose effects are discussed, there are some individual designations. Many the sanctions against oligarchs, do they what are the effects? Do they lead to a new elite consensus with people who cannot travel outside, cannot run away to the EU, and therefore are very much in the hand of the Kremlin without influencing much of the final political decision? So that's one instance. In the research area, you find also a number of analyses who do criticize the extent of sanctions against what we call agro-oligarchs. So oligarchs that are involved in the food in the agricultural sector, which for some of them are genuine entrepreneurs and do not fit with the classical shady picture of Russian oligarchs, which made their fortunes thanks to their closeness to political power. And also that is linked to the debate we have on our outreach to the global south, where this issue of agricultural exports is taken over by Russian propaganda very, very effectively, with a classical KGB style active measures, and they tend to build on that and to build on this discontent against autonomous sanctions, which translate, for instance, in draft treaties, banning the use of unilateral coercive measures, or in the work of the rapporteur on economic unilateral measures, which was nominated by the UN Human Rights Council.
Thank you very much. Right, so there's three people waving with varied degrees of enthusiasm. We'll start with the four people. We'll start with Nicoletta. Where is the microphone, please? Hannah, Eleanor, the microphone, please. So Nicoletta, if you can keep your questions short, and I'll try and take a couple together.
My question is for Laima. Hi. How do you respond to the criticism that actually banks tend to be sanctions over compliant? So under the Iran sanctions package, we have seen that in order to not to fall foul of the blocking regulation, they used AML considerations not to work with Iranian partners. And under the Russia sanctions, even if the national regulator confirms that an associated entity is not designated, banks still point out to their own risk assessment and refuse working with that party. So I would like to hear your view. Thank you.
Okay, and then we'll come forward, please, Kinga, the gentleman. Yeah, exactly, perfect.
Thank you very much. My name is Alpas Turk. I'm a lawyer. Actually, my first question was also about overcompliance, which I assume a professional bias. Then I can shoot my second question to Kim. It's about implementation of adoption of sanctions and consultation with private sector. We know that the Commission has a broad interpretation of circumvention. In one of the FAQs, they mentioned that even the activities before the imposition of asset freezing measures may be considered as circumvention because in anticipation of the listing of the person. So how do you think that the kind of public consultation and the circumvention efforts would go hand in hand? Because as you mentioned, this is a legislation, but also a very particular type of it that would entail security considerations. Thank you.
Great. So Kim, why don't you have a go at that I'll tell you what, why don't you talk about overcompliance, and then Kim, you can think about answering that question.
Yes, no problem for that. That is one of the most common comments and questions for financial sector. Nevertheless, I will give two answers. First, as a lawyer, we all know in the case you are facing a huge liability, you will do everything in order to be sure that there is no possible stage where you will be the one who will suffer under this liability. And if we are talking about the financial sector, this is definitely not only about the criminal liability. In Latvia, this is a criminal offense, not compliance with the sanctions, but also about your reputation, about your possibility to be able to work in financial sector, etc. So nevertheless, it is about the liability. Therefore, in regard to sanctions, there always will be a little bit higher precaution than in case of AML. But secondly, I already speak previously about the resources. Sometimes over compliance and de-risking is caused also by just need to understand where you can put your resources to. And in case if you're having a lot of technical requirements, a lot of requirements that need to be done, you need to find a resource for that. And in that case, you have a less resource for investigations, less resource in order to understand the specific case, to be able to really track all the ownership and then the relationship flow through the transaction, etc. Therefore, that was also one of my suggestions to think more about the really purposely about these tasks for the sanctions where we really hit the goal. Because if we will have a lot of small requirements, they will take out the resources of the banks, which could be indulged more in the sanctions compliance field. Yeah.
Yes, my other challenge to the policymakers when they finish spending their day in a bank is if you sit there and say, we need more resources to deal with the tsunami of sanctions that are coming from Brussels, don't think you're the only ones that are having to make choices around, you know, who does what job in your ministry. It's happening in the private sector as well. Laima. Just
very short remark. We love sanctions on Friday evening. That means that Saturday and Sunday must be spent on them, and you are not in a hurry on a Monday, for example. Yeah,
this is true. Kim.
Thanks for the question. Well, I think you're hitting a very sensitive spot there, right? Circumvention and the question of, well, it's both a question of communication and obviously also about the sensitivities, because it involves third countries and so to say the relationship with European private actors to these third countries. And I think it's a lot. This relates a lot to the fact that I think over the past year, people have actually been uncertain of what circumvention actually entails. Where does the judicial or legal responsibility of an EU actor end and start and end? And I think it's good that the Commission here has made it much more clearer what they refer to as circumvention, that there is a EU jurisdiction or link to a EU partner there. I think it's important that this was opened up in the 8 package, that we're also looking to list entities outside the EU that being part of circumvention measures. I, however, do think that we need to again come back more to think a bit more principled about this, because right now, for me, I think it's commendable that it's part of the Russia sanctions package, but it stands out a bit weird that why is it not then part of all the other sanctions packages we have, right? And this brings me to the point that we should have a tool, or there's also an idea that I, amongst others, have been floating, maybe to think about a new horizontal EU sanctions regime. And I know those people sitting here doing these things will think, oh my God, not even more regimes, but think about it, right? Would it be possible to have a much more horizontal regime where we go after individuals who on a systemic level undermine the EU sanctions through circumvention? We have human rights sanctions regimes where we go after individual actors. Are we getting all human rights violators in the world with that? No, but we're sending a signal that we are actually able to do so, no matter which sanctions, or apart from the geographical challenges that we are facing, or the conflicts that we're trying to focus on, think about this much more holistically. And I think that it is possible to do this, coming just short of the secondary sanctions issue, because then, then we're in a completely different ball game.
If I could just make a point on the sort of the people who move their assets around in advance of sanctions being placed on them, and whether that's circumvention and so on. For many, many years, people have called for there to be action against individuals who have brought their money into Europe and enjoyed the lifestyle here and bought nice houses and lots of stuff. We all know the story, right? And parked their yachts off the coast in Nice or wherever it might be. There is, in my mind, a degree in all of this of kind of catching up with what should have been done in the past. This is an opportunity to take steps against individuals that we believe have earned the proceeds of corruption, have brought that to our countries, used that to influence politicians, use that to kind of interfere in whatever it is. And there is an element in this, and I don't want to overemphasize it, there's an element in this of now is the time to make up, use the opportunity to make up for what we should have been doing for years gone by. And so I think, of course, these individuals have moved their money around, they have used shell companies, they've done all that sort of stuff because they know probably at some point things are going to catch up with them. So I'm conflicted on that point. We should have done it 10 years ago. And now we're taking the opportunity to address the issue. There were two questions. Oh my goodness me, suddenly there's been an explosion of questions. Okay, they're gonna be very quick questions. We'll go, Uri will come to you. Ian, do you want to come back and ask your question? We'll go Uri, and then if you could pass the mic when you're done back to Ian.
All right. Stand up. Juraj Kuruc, Globsec Bratislava-based think tank. I have a question to Kim and Xavier. They're related, and it's to do with, is it even possible to pin down the exact cost of sanctions on us or individual states even? I mean, when the Russian propaganda is saying that the sanctions are not working and that their economy is doing fine, it's probably the exact opposite. But what's the cost on us? And I know for a fact that in Slovakia, cost of sanctions is a big pre-election topic. And so I would divide the question, if I may, but you're free to answer it, both of you. Kim, if you could have a look at what in terms of the economy, or how do you pin down the monetary value? And Xavier, you briefly touched in your remarks on the political cost. Is there a way to sort of remunerate a political cost of sanctions?
Thanks, Uri. And if you could pass the microphone back to Ian, that would be great.
Yes, hello, Ian Anthony from SIPRI in Stockholm. I wanted to ask the panel if you could develop a bit more the comments that some of you made about Russia's agency. Mr. Putin doesn't really hide what he's doing. It's just that we sometimes choose to ignore the parts that we find inconvenient. And if you look at his speech, his State of the Union speech, he goes very systematically through the stages of creating a war economy. He talks about science and technology, he talks about research and development, but he also talks about the education system, the mobilization of youth, the creation of nationalist narratives. It's a very comprehensive approach to developing Russia as a war economy. But we're sitting here talking about carefully calibrated, targeted measures, not to interfere too much or impose too much cost on ourselves. If one person is playing chess and the other is doing mixed martial arts, it's not going to end well for the chess player. Is there a point where we have to escalate our response into a more integrated approach to this?
Okay, thank you for that. So I think that's probably also for Kim and Xavier. So maybe Kim, you'd like to just talk about the pinning down the cost point, and anything you want to say about what Ian asked as well.
Sure. I think you're pointing to a very, very crucial topic there, right? That obviously it is very difficult to pin down the monetary costs writ large. And this is also why I think we should be able to at least speak more about, especially when we use trade measures, and especially when we use imports sanctions, that we should be able to at least speak a bit more about the goods that we're no longer receiving from Russia, and that that will have an impact on, you know, that is some kind of a supply shock. Of course, that supply shock can be, you know, mitigated over time, but that we are facing up to the costs that we're imposing on ourselves with sanctions. Again, and I think if we are stronger in pinning them down, like on specific goods, say, or categories of goods, then I think we also build better, more robust argumentation against the more broad narrative that sanctions are, you know, driving are the sole cause of, say, inflation last year, which is of course not true. Right, so it's also on us if we want to defend the sanctions and also say that they have limited costs, significant but limited costs, or isolate costs, then finding these costs. Shall I go on the? Yes, I completely agree with Ian's comments. Right, we need to understand the geoeconomic ball game that we are facing here and that we have put ourselves into as well in the sanctions field. When I talk about Russian agency, it's much more about we tend to analyze the potential impact of sanctions very much on a here and now basis. At least that's how we are, you know, communicating about this. These are the dependencies on the EU from the Russian side, so they will hit Russia this and that way. And then after 6 months, we are all surprised that Russia then starts trading more with other countries. It shouldn't surprise us, right? We know how markets work. Money flows like water to, you know, wherever it can go. So it's much more being realistic in the beginning of when we're imposing sanctions that, of course, this will lead to a reaction on the Russian side. But I absolutely take your point on not being too much of a chess player.
So we've had ball games, chess, mixed martial arts. Xavier, what would you like to say about the political consequences, and please get in a sporting metaphor?
Yes, but no, even on the economic consequences, one of the good surprises was how easily Europe managed its energy decoupling with Russia this winter, thanks to a number of factors such as good weather and also a Chinese-related COVID lockdown. I think on it's very tough to assess the political consequences. They will translate into further tensions with the global South. It would probably be more difficult for the West to pass a resolution at the UN Human Rights Council, for instance. But I mean, those criticisms, you could even hear them in countries as closely linked to the West and as prosperous as South Korea, for instance. So it's quite broad-based. Yes, and I'm coming back to an earlier question, but about the unintended consequences of sanctions. For instance, sanctions contributed to the revival of the Eurasian Economic Union, which was a pretty moribund, but due to this issue of sanctions circumvention, the redirection of flows, we also see that there is a surge in trade between Russia and countries like Armenia or Kazakhstan, whatever the feelings they may harbor towards Russian aggression.
Thank you very much. So very last question, because we need to finish. Yeah, please, Enrique. And could you introduce yourself? Just
Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm Enrique Visser, and I work at the Sentry corruption NGO, anti-corruption NGO. I have a question for Kim on the effectiveness of sanctions as well. I think it's very important that you mentioned to keep the time frame and the goal of sanctions in mind. I was also wondering about some other elements talking about effectiveness. I read a book of David Baldwin about economic statecraft, and he mentions that talking about the cost of sanctions, it's not just the cost of the sanctions itself, but you should actually compare it to alternative interventions. For example, military intervention, which is a lot more costly, of course. And then also, I think it's important to include, but I would love to get your opinion on that, the being honest about the willingness of certain actions. If we are talking about the effectiveness of sanctions, what other actions are there? If we're not willing to do military intervention, if we only have diplomacy and sanctions or doing nothing, then yes, we can be critical about sanctions, but what alternative is there? So I just wanted to get your input on those two elements.
Kim.
Yes, thank you. I think, the crucial point is that we will not have a binary discussion whether we do sanctions or not. And I think it's a bit banal point, but doing them smarter, right? So being better at them, because that was also the tense discussion, I think, last spring, that many sanctions experts felt that if you started to raise your voice in terms of saying, well, maybe is this the smartest approach, then you're very, very close to being called, a Putin versteher, or you don't want to do anything against Russia. So I absolutely take your point that that sanctions are one tool that is short of military action, but then discussing their effectiveness is not necessarily arguing against them, and that is hopefully not what you took from my intervention here today, but much more thinking critically about them as a tool of themselves.
Okay, we have run out of time. I can hear coffee cups clinking, which means there's clearly more coffee available. I'd just like to finish by thanking everyone for coming today, spending time with us. I'd like to thank very much everyone who's supporting the SIFMANet network. As you'll notice that none of us actually tell you what SIFMANet means because it's written up here and it takes about 5 minutes to read out. But I've learned in my years in the think tank world that if you don't have an acronym, nobody takes you seriously in Brussels. So it's very important to have an acronym, however curious it might be. But I'd like to go back to where I started, which is do please take a look at these recommendations for effective sanctions against Russia that we produced out of our workshop yesterday, which cover enhancing the status quo and going further and harder when it comes to the commitment that we must show to Ukraine through our economic measures over the course of this war. Looking ahead, we hope that the work we do at RUSI Europe and with the consortium members from SIFMANet will follow this roadmap. If you're interested in engaging with what we do, you can find us in all the usual places on social media and all the rest of it, and indeed just up the road in Avenue des Arts. If you are based here in Brussels, please do call in. But with that, thank you very much to Laima, thank you to Kim, thank you to Xavier, and thank you again to all of you for joining us here and online. Over and out.